Did you know that some of the most powerful people in ancient history were also related to each other? Welcome to my channel. And today let's find out why Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. Ancient Egypt was a time when the rulers were considered divine. The pharaohs weren't just any rulers. They were considered the living embodiment of Horus, the god of kingship, and the sun. They were said to have set the standard for all future pharaohs to follow, but you don't have to take my word for it. Let's check out some of the other famous sibling marriages in Egyptian history. And according to Egyptian mythology, Horus was the son of Osiris and Isis, who were brother and sister, husband and wife. King Tut is perhaps the most famous pharaoh in history, and he married his half-sister Tutankhamun. They had a long and happy marriage, and Isetnofret was one of the most influential women in Egypt. Their marriage was considered a great union, and they had several children together. But unfortunately, all of their sons died young, and it wasn't reserved for the pharaohs. It was also common among the elite and the wealthy. But hey, at least they weren't marrying their parents. That would have been a little weird, even for ancient Egypt. And Tutankhamun's death at the age of 19 may have been due to, you guessed it, inbreeding. So you see where this is going. It was believed that if the gods could do it, so could the pharaohs. And thus began the trend of sibling marriages in Egyptian royalty. Akhenaten was a pharaoh who changed the religion of Egypt, and his wife, the beautiful Nefertiti, was the daughter of his sister. Yes, it gets a little confusing, but that's just how the Egyptian royal family rolled. They believed that the pharaohs were actually gods on earth, and they had to keep their bloodline as pure as possible. Marrying within the family wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Now you know why ancient Egyptians kept it in the family. What do you think of this practice? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more fun facts about ancient Egypt. Thanks for watching. See ya. It was more like a duty, an obligation to maintain the purity of the divine bloodline. As one Egyptologist put it, it was a necessary evil to ensure the continuation of the royal bloodline. The pharaohs had to choose their spouses very carefully, often marrying their first cousins or half-sisters to minimize the chances of any, unwanted recessive genes kicking in. Now, you might be wondering, why not just marry someone outside the family, and bring in some fresh genes? Well, that was never an option for the Egyptians. They believed that the pharaoh's power came directly from his or her ability to trace their lineage back to the gods themselves. And if you introduce new genes into the mix, well, you never know what kind of, undesirable traits might pop up. The Egyptians weren't taking any chances. They'd rather stick with family. Now, how do you keep your bloodline pure? You might think of it as a modern-day practice where certain communities avoid marrying outside their faith or their community. But the ancient Egyptians took it to a whole new level. They married their siblings. Now, you're probably thinking, that's just gross. But in ancient Egypt, this was a sign of ultimate devotion to their gods and a way to maintain the sanctity of their bloodline. Now, let me tell you, this wasn't a small thing. But don't get me wrong, it wasn't all about the pharaohs having a good time. The first recorded marriage between siblings in Egypt was between King Minos and his sister Isit, and it was considered the ideal royal marriage. King Tut and his wife Enkisenamun, Ramesses II and his wife Isetnofret. Ramesses II was another famous pharaoh, and he also married his sister Isetnofret. Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti. Now, I could go on, but you get the picture. Sibling marriage was a common practice in ancient Egypt, so there you have it. You know how sometimes you see an ancient practice and think, that's disgusting. Why would anyone do that? Well, today we're tackling one of those practices, sibling marriage. The ancient Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the god Horus on earth, and before he took the throne, Horus had to do a little growing up. In ancient Egyptian religion, there were two super important gods. Osiris and Isis. The royal family was a divine extension of Osiris and Isis. There was no risk of an outside pretender claiming the throne based on some blood right. In Mesopotamia, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and the kings of Israel all had royal siblings doing the deed. It was basically the norm in most royal courts. So why did they do it? Well, for a lot of the same reasons the Egyptians did. Marrying your sister ensured that the bloodline stayed pure. It kept power within the family. And it made sense in a world where divorce was rare and often impossible. Once a king was wed, he was wed for life. Marrying your sister meant you didn't have to worry about your spouse going and having a secret baby with someone else and then taking the throne away from you. Plus, if your sister died, you could always marry one of your other sisters. Just in case. The power stayed in the family, in the bloodline, in the palace. That's why pretty much every single pharaoh married his sister. The prophet Ezekiel called it gross, and some Egyptian men even made jokes about it. But for the most part, it was considered normal. In fact, it was encouraged. Most famously, Tutankhamun married his half-sister Ankhesenamun. His great-grandfather Akhenaten married his sister. It's not exactly fun to think about your relatives in a sexual way. But for people in the past, it was all about keeping things in the family. So next time you think something is weird or gross, just remember, it could be weirder and grosser. Just ask the ancient Egyptians. And Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, married his sister. You get the idea? It was a common practice. If the gods did it, then so could the pharaohs. The line between god and ruler was blurry at best. The pharaoh was both the god Horus and a human being. He had to embody the divine order of the universe to keep everything running smoothly. This included following the divine blueprint set by the gods, like marrying your sister. To ancient Egyptians, marrying outside the family was kind of like diluting the divine bloodline. Sure, it may work for mortals, but when gods do it, that's a whole other ballgame. Marriage was about maintaining the sacred bloodline. It wasn't really about love. It was about duty. They were brother and sister, but they also fell in love, hard. They had a steamy romance, if you know what I mean, which resulted in the god Horus. Then Osiris died and became the god of the underworld. And Isis raised Horus solo, but she was also his wife. Does that make sense? Because it makes total sense. He lived with his mom, Isis, and she was also his god-wife. Now, you might be thinking, wait, weren't they brother and sister? How does this work? And to that I say, well, don't worry, you're not the only one asking this question. It took me years to figure out. More specifically, we're asking, why did the ancient Egyptians do it? Let's start with the gods. Okay, so here's the deal. To ancient Egyptians, family wasn't this separate unit from the rest of society. It was literally the building block of the universe. For a pharaoh, marrying a sister made sense. She was royal. That meant no one could take the throne from him or her. But the Egyptians weren't the only ones doing this. Marrying your sister was a common practice throughout history. It's important to note that this doesn't mean everyone was cool with sibling marriage. There were people who spoke out against it. In many ways, sibling marriage was a practical solution to the problems facing royal families. Thanks for watching. The boy king Tutankhamun is the most famous ruler of ancient Egypt. At least he's the most famous boy king. Everyone knows that. Well, maybe not everyone. Did you know? Come on. It's the cute gold mask. The cool tomb, the one that's full of treasures and also one of the few that wasn't robbed. And thanks to modern science, we know way too much about the boy king's messed up genetics. Tutankhamun is the most famous boy king in part because he was such a child when he died. He was only 19 years old. But there's another reason why this kid is so well known. Sure, marrying your sister might keep power in the family, but it didn't guarantee a healthy heir. Sometimes being related to your partner had some serious drawbacks. In trying to be gods, the pharaohs made very mortal mistakes. And he likely had a cleft palate that made it hard to talk, hence the duck waddle. There are other clues, too. Well, scientists have been able to learn more about the pharaoh's health thanks to modern technology. They used non-invasive technology like endoscopy and found that the boy king's bones were riddled with disease. His left foot was totally fused together, and his right foot was super misshapen. Those club feet were way worse than anyone thought. And there's more. He had bone infections in his toes, knees, spine, and pelvis. Plus, researchers think he broke his leg just before he died. That could explain why he was using so many canes. The king was in a lot of pain, which might have contributed to his untimely demise. In 2010, a high-tech scan revealed the extent of his injuries. Researchers could see that he had scoliosis, a bone disease that makes your spine curve. They could tell he had clubfoot and a cleft palate. They could even see the shape of his brain. He walked with a cane. No, not one cane. He was a sick kid who did his best to live as normal a life as possible. And sometimes that meant playing with a lot of canes. Dozens of canes were found in his tomb, all snapped in half. He hobbled everywhere. Unlike most of his royal relatives, Tutankhamun wasn't an evil overlord or a ruthless queen. He was pretty much the opposite. He tried to do his pharaoh duties like marrying your sister. That was a duty. Well, it was a duty in ancient Egypt, where royals were encouraged to marry siblings to keep the bloodline pure. Tutankhamun took this duty very seriously. He wed his half-sister, Osiris, genetic disease, all of the above. What we do know is that the boy king's death was probably pretty painful. His doctors tried to fix his ailments with a combination of drugs and surgery, which means he might have endured multiple operations before he died. Not exactly the gift that keeps on giving. Yes, they're related. No, it's not weird. Just shut up. Now, they had 2 daughters, but both babies were stillborn. Their tiny mummified bodies were buried with the king. It's a haunting reminder of what happens when you don't diversify your DNA. He was the world's most famous dork. His father, Akhenaten, was famous for marrying his wife Nefertiti. But the two split up and Akhenaten remarried his daughter. Either to cover up a messy divorce or because he really liked marrying family, who knows? We can't ask him. He's dead. And judging by his son's health problems, incest wasn't the best royal strategy. He was born with clubfoot, which means his feet were twisted and deformed. But the boy king wasn't bitter. Tutankhamun was one of the last of the incestuous 18th dynasty pharaohs. Tutankhamun's reign was short and tragic, though scholars still debate exactly how tragic. How did he die? Was it malaria? A broken leg? King Tut's story proves that the pharaoh system didn't always work. Now check out. Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered almost 100 years ago. So why are we just now learning these shocking details? But the biggest revelation came when experts examined his mummy for a second time. Yeah, they unwrapped him again. Don't hate. All this info has helped historians get a better sense of who King Tut was. He wasn't just a weakling. For more royal mishaps, including a royal pig assassination, check out. Who needs love when you got pharaohs? Welcome back to my channel. Last time we talked about how often kings picked their sisters as wives. The queen is the one who held all the cards in this scenario. Now you might be thinking, why on earth would she choose her brother? But remember, this was a world where the line between God and man was pretty blurry. And the pharaoh was considered a god among men. So it makes sense that these royals were willing to put their own bloodlines first, even if it meant marrying their brother. Love might be blind. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And you can always stick around for more historical tales. We've got plenty more where that came from. But these queens were playing the long game. Well, stay tuned and let me spill the tea on these royal relationships. They might just make you blush. Just remember, you could have been a queen in ancient Egypt, and in that case, you'd be looking for that royal bloodline, brotherly love or not. Sometimes because they were the only eligible candidate, and sometimes because having lots of siblings meant there to be someone suitable for everyone. But you know what? She had her own sacred status. So who did she call her own? None other than her brother, Pharaoh Moses. That's right. These two took the sibling bond to a whole new level, becoming both king and queen of Egypt. But why? Was it just too much sibling love? Not quite. See, in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a political title, it was also a religious one. The pharaoh was considered a god on earth, and the gods didn't play by our rules. In fact, they had a much more complicated system of unions than we do. Don't believe me? Let me break it down for you. The gods had some pretty unconventional preferences when it came to choosing their partners. Take, for example, the Egyptian god Ra. Now Ra, if you don't know him, he's basically the sun god, a big deal in Egyptian mythology. One day, Ra decided that he needed an heir, so he did what any lonely god would do and created a woman named Nut. And yes, you guessed it, Nut became the mother of all gods, including Re's son, Osiris. But here's where things get a little weird. After Osiris and his wife Isis had their son Horus Ra decided that he wanted to take a break from fatherhood. So he made Nut swear an oath that she wouldn't have any more children. I guess the old gods needed some alone time. Fast forward a few years and Ra's like, wait, I kinda want another kid. He goes to Nut and asks her to break her oath. But she's like, no way, Jose. She's not about to break her word. So Ra's like, fine, but I'm still gonna have a kid. And he impregnates Nut without her permission. Talk about a slippery situation. But back to the question at hand, why did Amos Nefertari choose her brother? Well, it wasn't just because she couldn't resist his charms. It's because in this case, marrying her brother was the only option if she wanted to keep her divine bloodline pure. Remember, in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a god. And the gods had some pretty strict rules about keeping their bloodlines pure. So, even if she wasn't into her brother, she knew that marrying him was the best choice for her legacy. After all, who better to carry on the bloodline than her own flesh and blood? Am I right? Sometimes it wasn't the king's choice at all. Today we re-talking about the times when it was the queen bee who chose her very own brother as her husband. You heard me right. Let's start with Amos Nefertari, a powerful Egyptian queen who was considered divine in her own right. She wasn't just royal by marriage. Now, you might be scratching your head wondering why this queen chose her brother over, well, everyone else. So the next time you swipe left on your Tinder date, thanks for tuning in. Did you know that Egypt's royal incest wasn't just a weird tradition? Nah, it was a way for pharaohs to hold on to power. Let me explain. Bringing someone from the outside world into the palace meant letting in a whole new family. A family with interests, ambitions, and maybe even armies of their own, like what if they had a son and he ended up becoming pharaoh? Everyone from the pharaoh to the priest to the bureaucrats had a vested interest in keeping things as they were, top-heavy and firmly in their hands. Marry your brother, marry your cousin, or maybe marry your uncle. And none of those options are particularly appealing. But that's what life was like for Egypt's royal women. They were pawns in a game of thrones played by men who valued bloodlines more than anything else. Men who would rather risk a civil war than marry outside of their family. Men who would rather gamble with their dynasty than with their throne. Now, don't get me wrong, this system worked for a long time. It kept the peace, kept the borders safe, and kept everyone focused on the really important things like how many wives the pharaoh had. But it also led to some, well, challenging times. Take Akhenaten, for example. He married his sister, and together they had 6 daughters. But after a few years, he started acting a little, well, off. Historians think he may have had a genetic disorder caused by all the inbreeding, and it showed. He spent his days partying, neglecting his duties and infuriating his counselors. Let's just say he wasn't exactly Mr. Pharaoh. Then there's Ramses III, who also had a genetic issue, but his story is a lot darker. He had a daughter with his sister, and according to legend, she wasn't exactly what they were expecting. Some say she was born with 2 faces, some say she had a single eye in the middle of her forehead. Either way, she didn't last long. As soon as she was born, she was killed. It's a brutal tale, but it makes a crucial point. The system wasn't just bad for Egypt's future pharaohs, it was bad for everyone, especially the women. Then you'd have a father-in-law who could basically run the country. Not exactly what you want when you're trying to keep your dynasty tight-knit. That's why marrying within the family was a safer bet. It kept all the power and land within the immediate royal family. No outsiders, no in-laws with agendas, no messy inheritance disputes. Just siblings holding hands under the blessed sun of Ra. Well, maybe not always so jolly, but you get the idea. You see, back in ancient Egypt, marrying outside of your royal family was kind of a risky move. Think about it. As the centuries passed, the royal gene pool got pretty shallow. Why? Well, for one thing, it was tradition. But tradition alone doesn't explain why this tradition stuck around so long. After all, people change their traditions all the time. It's what we do in our free time. So here's the real reason. Marrying within the family was in everyone's best interest, or at least the people in charge. The pharaoh wasn't just a title, it was a godlike status. And the bloodline of Ra, the sun god, wasn't just special, it was sacred. Mixing that bloodline with, well, anyone else seemed like a pretty bad idea. And not just because of what it might do to the next pharaoh's kidneys, but because of what it might do to their power. Kind of like when you have a small group of friends and everyone's related to each other. Things can get a little, well, let's just say special. You see, the Egyptian royal family tree had more branches than a sycamore and just as many close calls. Pharaohs were marrying their sisters, their nieces, their half-sisters, even their mothers. Now, I'm no geneticist, but that's a lot of family reunions. And the further down the line you go, the more the gene pool, well, pooped. This wasn't lost on the Egyptians. They knew what we now call genetic disorders. They saw it as a curse, a punishment from the gods for messing with the natural order. The pharaohs weren't stupid. They weren't having kids just for the sake of procreation. They were trying to produce heirs, healthy heirs. But as the centuries rolled on, the odds didn't look good. But there was a problem with this system, a big one. Still, the incestuous system didn't end there. It went on for over 30 dynasties, almost 3,000 years. Let's be real, ancient Egypt was a bit of a monarchy. Imagine being an Egyptian woman in the royal court. Your choices are pretty slim. So, yeah, ancient Egypt was a pretty messed up place. Who knew playing God could be so complicated? Thanks for watching. Pharaohs marrying their siblings is weird, right? Even by ancient Egyptian standards, it was kind of weird. There are records of at least 16 pharaohs who took on a spouse from their immediate family, which is a higher rate of inbreeding than even the royal families of Bourbon or Windsor. So you're probably wondering, did the average Egyptian think this was weird? Hi, it's me and welcome to my channel. Take, for example, the supposed romance between Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. There was a half-sister and 3 full siblings born to her parents, Ptolemy XII and Cleopatra V. Then there was a younger half-sister born to her father and another woman. And finally, there was yet another full sister born to her father and one of his handmaidens. Yeah, it gets complicated. Who's the Father of the Year award? Their relationship seems pretty intimate based on the descriptions left by Roman historians. But those historians were often heavily influenced by the royal court and prone to exaggeration and inaccuracy. Now, over the course of ancient Egyptian history, the rules about who could and could not marry whom changed several times. Temples, carvings, and ceremonies showed pharaohs as perfect, godlike, untouchable, immortal beings. Their family lives weren't exactly open to scrutiny, but talked about? Rarely. Denial wasn't just a river in Egypt, it was national policy. Thanks for watching. So, if the royal family was keeping secrets, it wasn't that hard to keep secrets. They just didn't really talk about certain things. Initially, there were no restrictions. But as time went on, some restrictions were put in place. Eventually, it was decided that only the pharaoh had to marry within the royal family. But still, that's a pretty small pool to choose from. The public image of the royal family was carefully controlled. It's true that many inscriptions downplayed or avoided the whole sibling marriage issue. Marriage between siblings was technically legal, but it wasn't exactly common. Most royal couples were in fact second cousins. Marrying your exact sibling was generally frowned upon, especially by the priests, because it reminded people of the story of Osiris and his wife Isis, who also happened to be brother and sister. In some versions of the myth, Isis was actually pregnant with Horus, another god, when she ran into her brother. In other versions, the two of them conceived while celebrating a ritual that was meant to make her pregnant. Either way, there's kind of a yikes factor. Priests would prefer it if people didn't really talk about that. Still, though, sometimes siblings did marry, so it wasn't taboo. Entirely unthinkable, it was just rarely talked about. It was like that one weird uncle everyone pretends is just eccentric. Here's the thing, the people of ancient Egypt worshipped the pharaohs almost like they were gods. And the pharaohs, for their part, liked to keep up that image. The rulers weren't exactly forthcoming about the more mundane details of their lives. That's why there are 0 surviving diaries from any pharaoh. They didn't have to explain themselves to anyone. The closest thing we have to a personal text from a pharaoh is a love poem Akhenaten supposedly wrote for Nefertiti. And even that is hotly debated among scholars because there are so few surviving examples of ancient Egyptian literature, anything even vaguely personal feels revelatory. We crave details about the private lives of the rich and powerful even today. But back then, there was no TMZ, no People magazine, no YouTube videos. The pharaohs could get away with murder, literally, because we don't know what went on in the palace. We can only know what the pharaohs wanted us to know. There are some stories about pharaohs that are told as if they were facts, but in reality, they're just propaganda. Cleopatra actually had quite a few siblings, and all of them held titles that denoted their relationship to her. So yes, it was known. Okay, so we just did a whole series about ancient Egypt, so now you're an expert. You know all about their gods and their pharaohs and their pyramids. And that means it's time for the inevitable. Yes, it's time for some dynasty drama. Eventually, Rome came knocking, and Egypt's divine royal bloodline ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. So here's how the Egyptian dynasties fell apart. This is Crash Course, not Crash Encyclopedia. We can't fit everything in. See how they're standing together with their hands almost touching? That's not just an artistic flourish. Akhenaten's successor, Smenkhare, seems to have struggled with his royal duties. The 18th dynasty collapsed into civil war. By the end of the century, Egypt was ruled by foreign invaders. By the Middle Kingdom, Egypt had recovered and entered a golden age, but it wouldn't last. The next two dynasties collapsed into civil war, followed by another foreign invasion. Egypt would never really recover. This episode was filmed at a studio and with our partner. You want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever? You can join our community on a crowdfunding platform. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was being ruled by foreign powers. The once mighty empire was gone. There are very few records of his reign, and none of them mention any children. Maybe he never had any. Maybe they just didn't make it into the historical record? Historians don't know. It's a symbol of their partnership, which produced heirs and advanced the interests of the kingdom. In other words, it was a power move. Ancient Egyptian art often conveys political messages. Well, there are a lot of reasons why Egypt fell. Historian Toby Wilkinson gives one simple answer: royal screw-ups. An annual flood that brought life-giving silt to the fields, predictable seasons, and enough water to support millions of people. But the Nile also acted as a barrier between Egypt and the rest of the world. Foreign influences rarely reached the isolated valley, and Egypt's culture flourished in relative peace. When outside forces did arrive, though, they brought new ideas and resources, and sometimes they just wanted to take all of Egypt's gold. Now, to be fair, this is a simplification. Wilkinson is talking about a handful of pharaohs who made disastrous decisions, like Akhenaten, who nearly destroyed Egypt's economy with his religious revolution, or his successor, Smenkhare, who may have been unable to produce an heir. But those are just two of many possible factors for Egypt's decline. Look at this relief showing Ramesses II smiting his enemies, like the growing power of the Hittites and other so-called maritime peoples. Still others point to internal rebellions or economic downturns. But whatever caused Egypt's collapse, the reasons were deeply entwined with the geography of the Nile River Valley. The exaggerated size of his rear end, also known as his backside, is no accident. It symbolizes strength and fertility, both of which were very important to the Egyptians. We have to pick and choose what to focus on. And for ancient Egypt, that meant looking at the big picture, the major turning points, the things that really changed Egyptian society and the course of its history. Like any good soap opera, this story starts with some royal screw-ups. Over time, Egyptian dynasties started to fall apart. Inbreeding took a toll, heirs got weaker, infighting increased. Some rulers couldn't even produce children. Later dynasties tried to break the cycle by marrying foreign princesses or expanding alliances, but by then it was often too late. The damage was done. The Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great, kept the tradition going. Cleopatra married both her brothers. Yay, progress. Now, before you start typing out your angry comment about how I totally butchered Egyptian history, let me defend myself. Like, look at this statue of Ramesses II and his queen Nefertari. We can see these same concerns in the famous bust of Queen Nefertiti, probably sculpted during the reign of her husband Akhenaten. Her body is also exaggerated in backside, her belly is round, her breasts are prominent, all of which signify fertility and motherhood, which were essential roles for women in the Egyptian kingdom. But not all families had such rosy views of procreation. Akhenaten's successors weren't so lucky. So why did Egypt's powerful dynasties keep collapsing? Other historians argue that Egypt's problems were caused by outside forces. For centuries, Egypt enjoyed the benefits of living along the world's greatest river. Hi, welcome to Crash Course. When you think of the most messed up relationships in history, you might be thinking about the time your ex got with your sister or your cousin, or that one time you totally forgot to RSVP. Yeah. Those are pretty bad, but they've got nothing on ancient Egyptian royalty. Because while we tend to think of romantic love as the basis for marriage, the ancient Egyptians did not. Since royal marriages were motivated by politics and bloodlines rather than romance, whose reign marked the beginning of Egypt's new kingdom around 3,340 years ago. Their names were Thutmose III and his wife Hatshepsut. As you can see from these statues, they were brother and sister. Why go through all of this? If you grew up in ancient Egypt, why wouldn't you just marry someone outside the family? Now, this wasn't a completely foolproof system. Researchers have estimated that the rate of first-cousin marriages peaked in the 18th dynasty. During the reigns of pharaohs like Ramesses II, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun, it's weirder than you think. Roughly 75% of marriages between royals were between first cousins, and it stayed above 50% for much of Egyptian history. As anyone with even a passing knowledge of genetics could have told you, after all, it led to increased rates of stillbirth, miscarriage, and infant mortality. It also likely played a role in the decline of the 18th dynasty. But the royal family kept on keeping it in the family for another 1,000 years. It's actually pretty difficult to come up with an accurate estimate of the inbreeding rates among the Egyptian royal family. That's partly because there were so many intermarriages between different branches of the royal family tree that it's really hard to sort through the relationships. And partly because, they wrapped the mummies and put them in tombs. Well, as you might have noticed, that wasn't really an option. The incest taboo didn't apply to the royal family. In fact, the pharaoh's spouse had to be related to them by blood. Otherwise, their kids wouldn't be considered legitimate. And as you can probably tell from their body language, they really weren't feeling it. The two of them never had sex, which is kind of awkward given that they shared a tomb with the mummies of several previous royal couples who definitely had done the deed. It didn't really matter if the happy couple was hot and heavy for each other, or even if they just liked each other. We know that several other royal couples throughout Egyptian history had no interest in getting physical with their sibling spouses. To make matters worse, the lack of consummation sometimes led to infertility, which meant that the royal couple had to take on additional wives in order to produce heirs. In fact, we've got some pretty solid evidence that some royal siblings in ancient Egypt weren't even that into each other. He married his sister Isis, and they had 6 sons together. But he also took on a whopping 100 other wives and concubines, probably because he wanted to make sure that at least one of them would produce a male heir. For men, that meant marrying someone who wasn't related to them in any way, shape, or form except being the offspring of the same parents. Now, you might be thinking this is all a little too Game of Thrones, and you'd be right. But there was one major difference between the royal families of Westeros and ancient Egypt. Marrying your sister or brother was hot, hard, and hard to avoid. Instead, they had a much more interesting motivation, a total lack of options. Your future wife could only be one of a select few: your sister, your half-sister, your aunt, your grandmother, or your great-grandmother. The pharaoh's wife, on the other hand, had slightly more options. She could choose her husband from among her sisters, her daughters, her nieces, or her granddaughters. In other words, if you were an eligible member of Egyptian high society, you were pretty much guaranteed to end up marrying one of your relatives. You see, the ancient Egyptians believed that their pharaohs were literally gods on earth. So when two powerful people decided to get hitched, they weren't looking for love. They were looking to produce heirs with the purest divine bloodline possible. For women, that meant no marrying outside the family. In fact, if you were a boy growing up in ancient Egypt, and that brings us back to love, take, for example, a royal couple from the 18th dynasty now. This is just one example, but it was by no means unique. Take, for example, Ramesses II, who took the throne around 1279 BC. But why? That's why the Egyptians kept marrying their sisters. It was the only way to keep the divine bloodline pure. But based on the evidence we do have now, this level of inbreeding probably had negative consequences for the genetic health of the royal family. After all, once power becomes sacred, anything can be justified, and that's the uncomfortable truth. The past isn't just weird. Thanks for watching.